In the mid-1970s, Marvel editor-in-chief Marv Wolfman felt that Peter Parker, the Amazing Spider-Man, who at this point was about to graduate from college, had begun to grow out of the teen demographic that was reading comics. With that in mind, Wolfman set about creating a new teen superhero in the form of Richard Rider.
What set Rider apart from other teen heroes was that he was spectacularly average. He wasn't super smart like Peter Parker, or rich and good-looking like Johnny Storm, or a mutant like a member of the X-Men. Richie was just your average high school nobody. That is, until he got drafted into the Nova Corps.
The Nova Corps is essentially Marvel's Green Lanterns, a cosmic police/militia group based on a hub world called Xandar. Now, each Nova Centurion is connected to a supercomputer called the World Mine. And in case you were wondering, yes, the Nova Corps are the characters that John C. Reilly and Steve Coogan played in the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie.
Rider was bestowed the mantle of Nova by a dying Corps member named Roman Day. The one drawback was that World Mine had to educate Richard on how to use his powers on the fly.
The original Nova series ran bi-monthly for about 25 issues. Not exactly setting the world on fire sales-wise, but it did gain something of a cult following. Nova would appear a few times throughout the 80s, until the point where he joined a teen supergroup called the New Warriors. I'll explain them a little bit later. Anyway, in 2007, there was a Marvel crossover event called Annihilation that set Nova on a new course, which means I kind of have to spoil Annihilation right now.
A dimensional crack called the Crunch opened up, allowing forces led by longtime Fantastic Four villain Annihilus to pour in from the negative zone. The forces tear through the galaxy, damaging much of the Kree Empire, obliterating the Skull Empire, and destroying Xandar along with the Nova Corps, save for Richard Rider. Being the last surviving Nova Centurion caused Richard Rider to receive a power boost, as he needed to serve as the host for the World Mine. Nova would go on to team with several other heroes and a few villains to beat back the Annihilation Wave, as it came to be called.
Picking up for the events of Annihilation, Nova would get a new ongoing series starting in 2008, the first 13 issues of which we're looking at today. And yes, I am aware that technically this ties in more to the Annihilation follow-up event, Annihilation Conquest, but for some reason Marvel just titled this storyline Annihilation. Anyway, this is Volume 1 of the Nova hardcovers, Annihilation.
Nova rockets around the cosmos, answering as many distress calls as he can. Many of the planets he arrives are a little shocked and a little disappointed to find out that he's the only Nova Centurion coming, but he proves himself more than capable of eliminating threats. However, World Mine is growing concerned. Richard is beginning to overextend himself, and since the two are synchronized, if Richard dies, so does the World Mine. So the supercomputer suggests that it might be time to slow down and try to find a planet in which to restart the Nova Corps. After he inadvertently crashes into a planet, Richard agrees that he needs a break. Richard opts to return to Earth and his parents' home on Long Island. It turns out to be a surprise to his family because, well, Richard left more than a year ago, and he left with the New Warriors.
Like I said before, Nova was a founding member of the New Warriors, a teen supergroup, and eventually that group would break up and then reunite to be the focal point of a reality TV show, with Nova actually leaving the group soon thereafter to deal with the events of Annihilation. Anyway, while Nova was gone, and in an attempt to boost ratings, the New Warriors attacked a small cadre of supervillains hiding out in Stamford, Connecticut. Principally, one of the villains was named Nitro, who had the ability to turn any object he came into contact with into an explosive. Nitro wound up setting off an explosion next to a school and winding up killing 612 people, including the school children and most of the New Warriors. It was this event that precipitated the passage of the Superhero Registration Act that was the focal point of Marvel's Civil War storyline that ran concurrently with the events of Annihilation.
Richard's reunion dinner with his parents is interrupted by the arrival of Iron Man and S.H.I.E.L.D. Richard is brought on board a helicarrier where he and Tony Stark fill each other in on recent events, namely the events of Civil War and Annihilation, with Richard having to inform Tony about the death of former Avenger Wendell Vaughn, aka Quasar. Tony invites Richard to register and use Earth as a new homeworld for the World Mine. Richard is intrigued, but he needs some time to think about it. Richard then talks with former New Warrior Vance Astrovic, aka Justice. Vance tells Richard that founding New Warriors members Night Thrasher and Amarita were killed in the incident, while Speedball disappeared from prison and his whereabouts are currently unknown. Richard returns to his home to sleep and allow Worldmind to see if everything's okay amongst the stars. This leads to an unsettling confrontation with Richard's father. Afterwards, Richard decides to take a walk. However, not even that can provide any peace, as Richard is confronted by an old foe named Diamond Head. Richard takes down the villain with ease, but runs into trouble because he's an unregistered hero who just made an arrest. This has attracted the attention of the Thunderbolts.
Okay, look, I know there's a whole big history with the Thunderbolts, but unfortunately we just don't have the time to get into it right now. Just at this point, they're under the control of Norman Osborn, and they sort of function like the Suicide Squad of the Marvel Universe, in the sense that they are criminals who are forced by the government into being heroes.
Nova begins to take on the Thunderbolts, save for one named Penance, who freezes when ordered to attack. Eventually, Penance asks forgiveness for Richard and drops a building on top of him. It's then that Iron Man arrives to put a stop to the action. Iron Man apologizes to Nova, explaining that he had not yet put out a message about Nova's return. Stark explains to Richard that he needs to register, citing the fact that the new Warriors aren't looked favorably upon by the public. Richard still needs time to think about it, as he's still the last Nova Centurion, and he needs to be working on restoring the core before doing anything else. Richard returns home to another argument with his parents, who also want him to register. Finally, Richard exits his home and prepares to leave, only to notice Penance has followed him. However, this isn't a fight. Robbie Baldwin just wanted to talk to his old friend.
Robbie Baldwin was a teenager working at a chemical research lab when an accident caused him to generate the ability to tap into an energy field that allowed him to create basically protective energy balls that would activate whenever Robbie was being attacked. Robbie would adopt the name Speedball and become a carefree, fun-loving member of the New Warriors. That is until the events of Civil War. As it turns out, Robbie was actually the one who caused Nitro to set off the explosion that killed all the school children. And because of that, Robbie basically slipped into a depression. His powers also metamorphosized so that they activate now even more when he feels pain. To this extent, Robbie adopted a new identity in which he donned a costume that was riddled with spikes. This is why Robbie's face is all cut up when you see it. And he now bears the name Penance.
Richard tries to console Robbie, but Speedball/Robbie are gone. Only Penance remains. He implores Richard to register so they won't have to fight again. But right now, Nova has to leave Earth. He doesn't feel welcome on his home planet anymore. Richard says goodbye to Robbie, reminding him to never become something he isn't, and takes off. Before leaving the atmosphere, Richard manages to hack into his parents' satellite signal and apologize, then say goodbye.
It's at this point we actually pick up with Marvel's Annihilation Conquest event that involves a group called the Phalanx Covenant sweeping through in the wake of the Annihilation Wave. Now, the Phalanx are a techno-organic hive mind who travel from planet to planet, draining it of energy by infecting the beings on that planet with the transmode virus that turns them into Phalanx. Or to put it simply, they're the Borg from Star Trek The Next Generation.
Nova arrives near the heart of the Kree Empire to answer a distress call. Much to his surprise, he gets attacked by a fleet of Kree sentries, which doesn't make any sense given that the Kree are the ones making the distress call. However, the planet has already been infected, much to the delight of Gamora, who's also interested in the returning Nova Centurion.
Okay, well, this is the same Gamora from the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. There is some differences here. Namely, Gamora still kind of remained an assassin long after she abandoned Thanos, and she's walked the line between hero and villain ever since, though she did fight alongside the heroes during the Annihilation event, even engaging in a brief romance with Richard Rider.
Nova finds himself overwhelmed by Kree sentries in a needed attempt to escape. He opens a Stargate and attempts to jump through hyperspace. However, Gamora manages to blast Nova with a shot that infects him with the transmode virus. Richard takes off to the Stargate, but Worldmind can't help too much as the computer is fighting the virus. This results in Richard beginning to burn up, and with no other choice, Nova crashes onto a planet located on the outskirts of the Kree Empire. The crash catches the attention of a Kree woman named Ko-Rel, a field medic turned leader after much of the planet was taken out after the Annihilation Wave. Ko-Rel inspects the crash site, and Worldmind explains that he has no other choice, as Richard's body is too damaged to continue on. So Worldmind deputizes Ko-Rel as the new Nova.
I've talked about the Kree a few times during this, but I never exactly explained who it is they are. The Kree are an intergalactic empire that rule via their vast scientific and technological knowledge. In fact, the Kree are actually ruled by a being called the Supreme Intelligence, that is the physical manifestation of all of the smartest and brightest and most creative members of the Kree's minds in a giant tub. Now, the Kree generally appear to be blue-skinned, though they do have a few other variations in skin tone, and they have spent generation upon generation trying to remake the entire Marvel Universe in their own image.
Worldmind explains to Ko-Rel that her powers are somewhat limited due to Richard's recovery, not to mention having to keep the transmode virus at bay. Still, she does her best to protect her people, as long as her subordinates stop checking out her butt in the uniform. However, Ko-Rel privately has reservations. She has a son named Zam who she is separated from and she doesn't even know his whereabouts. Being a Nova Centurion should allow for a family reunion, which has naturally left Ko-Rel conflicted. It's then that a Phalanx troop headed up by Gamora arrives. Ko-Rel takes off to beat back the Phalanx, but it's all a ruse as Gamora slips onto the Kree hideout and locates Richard Rider. She kisses him, allowing him to become fully infected by the transmode virus. Worldmind contacts Ko-Rel as Richard and Gamora leave. The computer explains it has to devote more power to fighting the transmode virus and infecting Ko-Rel as well, so there's only one option left. She has to locate Richard Rider and kill him. Meanwhile, Richard and Gamora happen across an old cohort in Drax the Destroyer. The two make quick work of Drax and take him off to be infected.
Okay, we have to separate comics from movies again here. Drax is actually the reincarnated soul of an Earthling named Arthur Douglas who was killed by Thanos. Douglas's soul was then placed in another body and basically given instructions to kill Thanos in revenge. Now, Drax has actually died and come back on a few occasions, and just before the events of Annihilation, he wound up getting teamed up with an Earthling girl named Cammy. After the events of Annihilation, Cammy was subsequently left on the moon of Titan, which is the world of the beings who resurrected Drax to begin with.
As the two make off with Drax, Gamora explains to Richard that the Phalanx has evolved, allowing individuals to retain personality traits while still being part of the collective, and this is why the two could partake in a romance while still being part of the Phalanx. Sexy time, unfortunately, gets interrupted by the arrival of Ko-Rel, who tackles Richard. Richard realizes that Worldmind is working against him, but points out that he's still more powerful than Ko-Rel, and the two fight with Ko-Rel trying to get away long enough to regroup. Unfortunately, Ko-Rel gets jumped by Gamora and stabbed in the back. Dying, Ko-Rel tells Richard to remember who he is and to find her son Zam. She hands over a holographic projector with Zam's image on it, but it gets smashed by Gamora as Ko-Rel dies. Richard and Gamora head back to the Kree homeworld of Hala, where the Phalanx have set up shop. Along the way, something gnaws at the back of Richard's mind. Suddenly, Richard finds himself in a white room talking to another Nova Centurion. It's Worldmind, making a last-ditch attempt to free Richard from the Phalanx. Richard then sees a vision of Ko-Rel dying in his arms and saying Zam's name, snaps Richard out of the Phalanx. Worldmind tells Richard to get as far away as he can so as to weaken the virus. He fights off Gamora and other Phalanx and gets away, but Gamora and Drax are in hot pursuit. Richard comes out of the Stargate and realizes he has no idea where he is. Worldmind reveals that Richard appears to be located in the Crunch, a point in the universe where the Big Bang is said to have originated from, and which Richard remembered hearing about from Star-Lord. Before he can pinpoint his exact location, Richard is overwhelmed by a cosmic storm and blacks out. Richard comes to on a mysterious ship with a strange woman cowering in a corner. He tries to comfort her, only to have her turn into a zombie-like creature and attack. Richard blasts her as some non-monster friends of hers arrive and accuse him of murder. Richard blasts away, feeling even more depressed having killed someone else. It's then that he's approached by a talking dog in a cosmonaut suit. The dog explains that this is Nowhere, with a K, and it's not a ship, it's actually the head of a Celestial.
The dog is named Cosmo, and yes, he was a Soviet space dog who accidentally fell out of Earth's orbit and wound up getting mutated by cosmic rays. Now, Celestials are effectively space gods, whose existence dates back to shortly after the events of the Big Bang. Celestials often appear as 2,000-foot-tall armored giants and have the ability to move entire planets with relative ease.
Cosmo goes on to explain that there are many who have traveled to Nowhere to research the Crunch. However, they had to be funneled into a special pocket dimension after the Luminals, the group Nova encountered earlier, arrived and brought something with them. As this is happening, the surviving Luminals are checking on a large containment unit. The unit cracks open and the Luminals are transformed into zombie-like creatures like before. The zombified Luminals go after Nova and Cosmo, and the two do their darndest to hold them off, as Worldmind deciphers that the Luminals brought on board an imprisoned dark entity known as the Abyss, and Nova makes his way towards the containment unit. It's then that he infects it with the transmode virus, and it's only a temporary fix, but Cosmo promises that next time, nowhere will be ready. However, for Richard, it turns out that his resistance to the virus has weakened, and Worldmind concludes that the only place to rid himself of the transmode virus is to visit Kivich, the homeworld of the Phalanx. Richard says his goodbye to Cosmo, giving the dog a chew toy as he leaves. Moments later, Gamora and Drax arrive and kill several citizens of Nowhere to learn where Richard is headed. The next thing that happens is that Richard and Gamora awaken on a strange planet. Richard wants to figure out what happened, while Gamora just wants Nova dead for deserting the Phalanx. The fight is interrupted after an attack by what appear to be large bacteria-like creatures. Worldmind explains to Richard that fighting will exhaust his energy reserves, so Richard grabs Gamora, he just can't leave her behind, and flies off. The two stop and bicker some more as Worldmind discerns that they are actually inside a Vor, a creature known for hunting in between dimensions. The creature doesn't really want to eat either of them. It's actually giving birth. Worldmind directs Richard and Gamora through the Vor's birth canal, where Nova blasts out into space. The truce between the two is short-lived, as Nova stuns Gamora before she can stab him in the back. He then manages to locate Drax and dumps Gamora off with him before heading off to Kivich. Richard then begins flashing back to how he became Nova. He was just an average kid from Long Island. He stunk at sports, and the only girl willing to talk to him was Ginger, an equally as unpopular goth girl. It turns out this is really a side effect of the transmode virus, making the infected remembering past aspects of his or her life. And in reality, it's 20 years from the events of the war, and Richard has been in a recurring coma. In the meantime, Worldmind was able to restart the Nova Corps. The computer has used a few familiar faces from Richard's past, including a resurrected Quasar. The Corps is preparing to defend Earth from assimilation by the Phalanx. Unfortunately, they're too late, and they're greeted by a group of infected Avengers. Richard then wakes up from another coma to the news that the Corps isn't faring very well. Richard Rider decides to power up one last time alongside Zam, Kor-El's son. Richard then awakens in a place surrounded by some kind of biomachinery. As he breaks free, Worldmind explains that they're on Kivich, home of the Phalanx. It turns out that Richard was in a completely different coma, and the vision of the future was also a side effect of the transmode virus. The biometal on Kivich turned Richard into a Babel Spire, which drew the attention of a Phalanx Siredom, or Overlord. Nova tries to take on the Siredom, only for the fight to be interrupted by the arrival of another Siredom. The two giants begin to square off, and Nova begins to transform once more into a Babel Spire, only to be saved at the last minute in the form of Warlock.
Mutants in the Marvel Universe aren't just limited to Earth. They exist on other planets as well. Case in point, Warlock, who is actually a mutant Phalanx, who is capable of more independent action than his brothers and sisters. Warlock went on to become a longtime member of the New Mutants until he returned to Kivich, where he discovered a fellow mutant Phalanx named Tyro and took him on as a son, even though the two aren't actually related.
Warlock gives Richard enough energy to free him from the Babel Spire, and the two go underground. It's where Tyro is waiting, and he's chomping at the bit to take on a Siredom. However, Warlock feels that his adopted son isn't strong enough yet. Meanwhile, Gamora and Drax arrive on Kivich. The search doesn't last long as they immediately transform into a much larger Babel Spire. This in turn brings a much larger Siredom, one that can easily detect Nova, Warlock, and Tyro. Nova asks Warlock if there's anything to be done. Warlock explains that he could donate his life energy to Richard, but it wouldn't be enough to stop the Siredom or purge the transmode virus, and it would leave Tyro open to possibly being assimilated. Richard promises to use the energy to leave Kivich and get Tyro to safety, so Warlock sacrifices himself. Nova takes off and begins running interference on the Siredom so Tyro can escape, except Tyro ignores Richard's instructions and simply dives straight into the Siredom's mouth. It turns out this was all part of Tyro's plan, as he has the ability to assimilate himself into the Siredom, meaning he now controls it. Not only that, but Tyro now has enough energy to resurrect Warlock and purge the virus from not only Nova, but Drax and Gamora as well. Now Nova has a small army to take on the Phalanx.
And so concludes the first 13 issues of the 2008 Nova series collected in the hardcover Volume 1, Annihilation. How was it? Well, without trying to sound too glowing, this book is spectacular. There's some great storytelling through all this. You have essentially three story arcs. You have the Richard Rider Returns to Earth story arc. You have kind of the early Phalanx stuff with Kor-El. And then you have the Richard Rider trying to locate the Phalanx homeworld storyline. I think all of them are handled really well. I mean, Richard has some great characterization throughout all of this. His humanity really does show through a lot of the times. Even when he's under the control of the Phalanx, You can tell there's kind of part of him that's still trying to fight it as best as he can throughout all of it. And the stuff when he returns to Earth and is reuniting with his parents and Robbie Baldwin and all of that, just, it has some real gravitas to it. And there's some great artwork from both Sean Chen and Paul Pelletier in this. That being said, the book isn't entirely perfect either. The characters of Gamora and Drax really kind of fall flat. I think because a lot of their development maybe happened outside of this series and in other parts of the Annihilation Conquest event. They kind of get underserved in the Nova book. I mean, they're not Nova, so I guess I can understand that too in a bit. Also, the whole annual issue, which is the scenes where Richard is flashing back to his origin and then into the future because it was a dream within a coma within another dream that was within another coma. Yeah, that just really felt like filler. I don't think it really needed to be collected in this at all. It doesn't really serve much of a purpose. Also, for some reason, the back cover blurb to this book refers to Ko-Rel as a Kree hottie, which, given that her storyline involves trying to find her lost son and her unfortunate death, feels a little inappropriate. But admittedly, those negative points are kind of nitpicky. I am going to give this book, the Nova hardcover volume 1 Annihilation, an A. Now technically this might be out of print, but you could get a digital version on Comixology, and I think you can even get it on the Marvel Unlimited app. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review. Remember, you can help support my work at patreon.com/sleepytimeforcatproductions, where you can request a trade to be placed in the randomizer, aka the cardboard box.